state-by-state polling has not been kind to Joe Biden. As we've talked about in previous videos, Joe Biden's numbers are abysmal all across the country. And as of today, the recording of this video, Joe Biden only has a favorable rating in 3 states in the entire country. Even historically Democratic states like California, for example, Joe Biden's underwater by 3 points. Colorado, he's underwater by 14. Virginia, 16. Maryland, 1. New York, 6. Connecticut, 6. Maine, 13. So on and so forth. Joe Biden is unpopular across the board. Obviously, he's more unpopular in red states. Blue states, he still has an unfavorable rating, but it's not nearly as bad. But the national numbers have Joe Biden currently underwater by 22 points. But that's not the topic of today's video. Today's video is to talk about the blue state where Joe Biden has the lowest favorability rating of all. And that is the state of Delaware, Joe Biden's home state, where he's currently underwater by 24%. 58% of Delaware voters disapprove of Joe Biden. Just 34% approve. So we're going to get into this in today's video and talk about Delaware politics more broadly and potentially why Joe Biden is so unpopular in the state of Delaware and what this could mean going into the 2024 election. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this is a number that quite surprised me, and honestly, I've seen no articles about it whatsoever. No one's really talking about it, but this is, in my opinion, a pretty big deal because this is Joe Biden's home state. It's a state that he won by nearly 20 points back in the 2020 election, and Joe Biden is doing worse in the state of Delaware than Virginia, than Wisconsin, than Minnesota. These are all states that are much, much redder than the state of Delaware. And yet Delaware, Joe Biden is underwater by 24 percentage points. Now, I think part of what could explain this potentially is a bit of skewed polling. Delaware is a very small state, so it's a very hard state to poll. It's a state of less than 1 million people. And its population is really concentrated in the Wilmington area around in Newcastle County. So, Delaware is not a swing state. So that's why it's pretty surprising that Joe Biden is doing so poorly here. And you'd also think in a state that Joe Biden has represented for decades that Joe Biden would have more favorable numbers. Now, like I said, one reason for this could be the fact that voters in the downstate portion of the state, Kent County, Sussex County, are being oversampled in polls. That certainly could be a factor. But it also is just down to the fact that many voting blocks are not happy with Joe Biden. If we take a look at the breakdown of the Delaware numbers, Joe Biden is underwater by 24 percentage points in his home state. That's worse than it is nationally at the moment. We could take a look at where it was when he started. When Joe Biden started his term, he was at 54% approval, 38% disapproval. Now, that's honestly a little bit higher than I would have expected. I mean, if we go back to the 2020 election, Joe Biden won the state of Delaware by 19 points. So you'd think at that point in his presidency, at the very beginning, his favorability would be probably in the low 20s. But no, in the state of Delaware, it was 54-38. Now, if we compare that to other states, let's say Pennsylvania, for example, a state that had voted for Joe Biden by 1.2%, Joe Biden's favorability started at +2 in the state of PA. We take a look at Wisconsin, for example, a state that voted for Joe Biden by just 0.6. Joe Biden was always unpopular in Wisconsin throughout pretty much the duration of his presidency. So the fact that Delaware's numbers are a bit lower than we would have expected is a little surprising. But again, I don't think it's certainly out of the realm of possibility. But like I said, Delaware is a small state, so it's very hard to poll a state like Delaware. But, we could take a look back at 2020, for example, and look at some of the statewide polls there because it had Joe Biden up by around 24 points in some of the aggregates. He ended up only winning by 19. So, the polls favored Joe Biden by several points back in 2020, but for the most part, the polls were fairly accurate. I think they overestimated him a little bit. So you could argue that potentially maybe the polls are underestimating Joe Biden this time around, but to be unfavorable by 24 percentage points in your home state, I don't think that comes down just to a polling error. I think there is a massive amount of voters in Delaware that disapprove of Joe Biden. If we take a look at the breakdown, younger voters, 67% disapprove. That's basically something we've seen all over the country, but in Delaware it seems to be slightly worse. Even among 65 and plus, which in Delaware is a much more left-leaning voting demographic, 52 to 43, a 9-point negative favorability among senior citizens, 35 to 49, 59-31, and then 57 to 35 among 50 to 64-year-olds. When it comes down to the gender gap, you have males disapproving of Biden 66-27, females 51-39. Next, we go down to party ID. Only 66% of Delaware Democrats approve of Joe Biden, 21% disapprove. Obviously, with Republicans, the number is going to be abysmal. But with independents in Delaware, 79% disapprove of Joe Biden, just 14% approve. When you break it down by race, white voters, 64-29 disapprove of Joe Biden. 52%, only a little bit more than half of all black voters in Delaware disapprove of Joe Biden. 33% approve. Latinos, 64-28 disapprove. And then the other category, 62-30. So really, really bad numbers if you're Joe Biden. Again, this is Joe Biden's home state. You could argue it's a hard state to pull, but I think you can't really argue with the fact that consistently he's getting poor marks in states that are considerably bluer. So it shouldn't be surprising that Delaware ranks pretty high on the Biden disapproval list. Now, if we go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton only won the state of Delaware by 11.4%. So a pretty close margin for a very blue state. Now, that's mainly because Donald Trump had a massive surge in turnout in Sussex County. Sussex County has also been an area of the state of Delaware that's been growing. It's the reddest part of the state by far, and it has a decent population, 59-37. So Donald Trump won this county by around 22 points. You also had Trump flip the swing county of Kent by almost 5 points. And then, of course, you saw a significant shift to the right in Newcastle County, home to Wilmington, 62-32 for Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton won Newcastle County by less than 30 points. And you compare that to Obama back in 2012, he won pretty comfortably, 66-32. So that's the reason why the overall margin in Delaware got significantly closer. So again, this is also a story of Hillary Clinton just doing bad in the state. You had 3.3% of voters going to Gary Johnson, 1.4% to Jill Stein, and about half a point going to others. So, other Democrats on the ballot did fine. John Carney, the candidate for governor, won fairly comfortably, 58-39. So this really was down to Hillary Clinton just being a very poor candidate. And ultimately, this is what got us the close result that we had in comparison to where Delaware usually votes back in 2016. Now, if we go to 2020, Joe Biden won pretty comfortably. Part of this was due to the swing among suburban voters, but you saw the biggest shift to the left, interestingly enough, in Sussex County. You have a decent retirement community down here in the beaches area, and I think that's why you saw a significant shift to the left. This area has also been growing, and some of these voters may be voting more Democratic. This has been sort of advertised as an area for retirees from the Northeast to sort of come down here because Delaware has a fairly moderate climate, a good healthcare system, and that's another reason why you could see probably the biggest shift in Delaware to the left coming from Sussex County. But Newcastle County, nearly 8 points. Kent County, 9 points. And that's where you get this 19-point margin. So a lot of these were just Democratic voters, I think, coming home to the Democratic Party. But going ahead in 2024, there's no polls in Delaware, really. You've got one poll where Joe Biden has 50% of the vote, Donald Trump getting nearly 40%. You have Joe Biden against Robert F. Kennedy. That's around a 4-point margin. And then you have Donald Trump versus Robert F. Kennedy. Now, these two polls you could throw out because they're completely ridiculous, but they also, all these polls have small sample sizes, so I don't know if I'd really base a lot off of these polls. But, overall, Delaware I still think is a safe Democratic state. I don't think there's really any competitiveness here, but you could see Donald Trump potentially get 41% of the vote again because he's probably going to do well downstate. I think it's really more of a question of how much Biden loses in terms of support, not so much Donald Trump gaining, because Delaware is not close to becoming a red state. It's not remotely competitive, but this is something we could see in blue states all across the country. Donald Trump gets around the same percentage he did back in 2020, maybe does a point or so better. I think certainly in states like New Jersey, California, New York, I think Donald Trump could do several points better. But when it comes to states like Delaware, I think his vote percentage might increase maybe by a point or so, but I think it'll be Joe Biden that probably loses 2, 3, maybe even 4% to third-party candidates like Robert F. Kennedy, Cornel West, the Libertarian, so on and so forth. So, I don't really think Delaware is going to be that close in 2024, but I did think it was pretty surprising that Joe Biden has such bad polling here. Potentially, you could see black turnout down in Wilmington. That would certainly be something that would help Donald Trump overall and would hurt Joe Biden. But ultimately, again, Delaware is still a very blue state. The last time Delaware got remotely close in a presidential election was back in 2004, where George Bush came within about 8 points of winning the state. But that goes to show you that Delaware is still very blue overall. Again, if we go back to 2004, this was an election where Virginia was voting for Bush by 8 points. Nevada was voting for Bush by 4. New Mexico voted for Bush, I think, very narrowly by less than a point. So Delaware is not in that list of states that we talked about yesterday where you could see Donald Trump potentially make some inroads, maybe expand Republicans' prospects there in the future. Delaware is just not there. It's a small state. It's a state that's often neglected in presidential elections. Joe Biden's also the president, so, he does still have, I think, some sway in the state. But overall, I thought it was just very noteworthy and sort of just illustrates the fact that Joe Biden is just very unpopular all across the country, even in his home state. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.